bias is bias.
Right.
So you've got to know what bias is in order to avoid it.
Originating from deep inside the Rocky Mountains, transported through the power of the internet, and arriving inside your tiny earbuds. It's the Appraiser Coach Podcast, helping appraisers increase their efficiency, quality, and make more money. Here's the guy who makes it his life's mission to create value for real estate appraisers nationwide. Your host and the Appraiser Coach, Justin Harris.
Welcome, everybody, to the Appraiser Coach Podcast. Thank you for joining me. Can't wait to introduce my favorite guest coming up. But first, I want to pause and remind you that we are sponsored by a great company called A La Mode. A La Mode, of course, is the software that I use to write up all of my appraisal reports. You should be as well. Go to alamode.com or 800 A La Mode. OREP is my E&O, and it's more than that. It's not just E&O insurance, folks. It is many, many benefits you're not going to get from other companies. I'll tell you about a few of those coming up. But in the meanwhile, check them out at orep.org. That's OREP.org. You want to welcome to the program Mr. Tim Andersen, who, by the way, Tim, I don't know if you caught the recent episode that I did on the top 10 podcast episodes or most listened to podcast episodes of 2022. And your name came up several times, episodes that you were on. I think you had 3, maybe 4 of the most listened to episodes of last year. So congratulations on that.
Oh, Justin, thank you. I appreciate that. That means a lot to me. Thank you.
Well, you bring up interesting topics. And just to set this up, for those of you who are new to the program, Tim is not an active appraiser anymore. He did that for decades, but now is an advocate for appraisers. In fact, he what is your name, Tim? Your moniker?
The Appraiser's Advocate.
The Appraiser's Advocate, that's right. So one of the things that Tim does is he assists appraisers who might be before the state board. And as a consequence, he sees a lot of things that we don't see. And things that I think appraisers should be interested in. Tim, recently I did an episode here on the podcast. I think it was entitled "You Don't Know What You Don't Know." And by the way, you reached out to me because the recording was done before it was actually played. So I know you hadn't actually heard the episode, and maybe you have a direct line into my computer. I don't know, but it was interesting that you reached out to me recently and said that you wanted to talk on the program about a topic that was very similar to that, but you had a name for it, and it was a name that I didn't know. So I guess I didn't know what I didn't know. So let's start with that. What is the name of the effect?
Well, Dustin, before we get into that, yes, I've hacked your computer and bank accounts.
Well, have at it, my friend. There's not much there, but you're welcome to it.
Dustin, the psychologists, specifically 2 of them, whose names I'm going to cite in a minute, studied the concept of people not knowing what they don't know. And we all know that there's stuff that we don't know. And the phenomenon is called the Dunning-Kruger effect. Okay. And it's among psychologists, it's considered a cognitive bias. But basically what it means is we don't know, and we don't know we don't know. So they studied it in the context of how people reported answers on tests, and then they said, okay, you're finished with the test, thank you very much, how do you think we did? Or excuse me, how do you think you did? And almost without variation, those who did very poorly said, oh yeah, I aced it, no problem, real simple. Whereas those who tended to do very well took the opposite attitude. In other words, well, that was challenging. I'm not really sure how well I did. And so their paper came back and said, okay, you've got all these people who thought they did very well, but they didn't very well. So as a result, not only did they not know what they were talking about, they didn't know what they were talking about. And I raised that issue relative to real estate appraisal, not to cast aspersions on the mental capacities or mental abilities of appraisers. That's not the point. But to bring up the fact that there are so many moving parts to a real estate appraisal. The body of knowledge is so vast that we can't know everything. In fact, we probably shouldn't, simply because you don't need to know anything about the condo market in South Florida, and I don't really care about the timeshare market in Idaho.
Right.
So we don't need to know that. But yet, in many cases, we don't know we don't know what we don't know. For example, many appraisers have trouble with the concept of highest and best use, simply because it's not taught in appraisal school, or if it is, it's taught very poorly. So when an appraiser goes into an assignment, the appraiser, the form says, okay, well, what's the highest best use? Oh, it's residential. Well, why is it residential? Well, because there's a house there. Well, okay, but what if the house is 150 years old?
Mm-hmm.
Is there any market demand for it? Well, who cares? There's a house there. Well, would the land be worth more without the house than the land and house are together?
Mm-hmm.
And this gets into the very core of highest and best use. And again, because appraisers are not trained in it, they don't know the questions to ask. They don't know what to look for. And the Dunning-Kruger effect is called a cognitive bias. And in our case, in appraiser's case, it's a bias because it inclines us toward our errors, not toward market facts. And that is basically the textbook definition of bias as far as USPAP is concerned. So as a result, given the political times in which we find ourselves, we've got to figure out as many ways as possible to avoid any kind of bias whatsoever.
Right.
Because quite frankly, the political spectrum has changed. Appraisers aren't getting nailed with the label of racial bias as much as they were. Rather, we're getting nailed with bias. And there are a whole bunch of types of bias. In fact, according to the Cognitive Bias Codex, there's something like 180 types of biases in which we can engage. So the more we understand, the more we can avoid. So we talk about the Dunning-Kruger effect, which is basically enshrined in the competency rule. And the competency rule says, appraiser, bless your heart, if at the time of accepting the assignment, you don't know what to do, please don't accept it, because you are undoubtedly going to make some errors, all of which will come back and bite you eventually. So as we talk about it, again, we're not trying to denigrate the intellectual capacity of appraisers. That's not the point. We're just trying to say there are limitations that you have. And while you can expand your knowledge, while you can expand your abilities, you've got to live within the abilities you've got at any given time. Therefore, when you try to expand out of them, go ahead and do so. But then you've got to do that under the hands of a mentor or a coach, so you can be brought back to reality when that becomes important. And you talk about working on something, not in something.
Mm-hmm.
And basically that's what it comes down to. You've got to work on the breadth and depth of your knowledge rather than spending all of your time buried in appraisals, because you can't expand the breadth and depth of your knowledge until you know what it is and until you know in which areas you want to expand.
You talk about cognitive bias, but I want to make sure that the listeners are clear. You're not talking about conscious bias. In fact, a lot of times bias is unconscious, right, Tim?
Oh, yeah. I mean, no appraiser wakes up and says, okay, this morning I got to take the dog to the vet and go to the gym and discriminate against two borrowers. No, that just doesn't happen. It happens because, as you indicate, Dustin, It happens unconsciously. Unfortunately, whether it's conscious or unconscious, the result is still bias.
Mm-hmm.
And the state will still sanction the appraiser, even if the appraiser was innocent of any malevolence.
Right.
Bias is bias.
Right.
So you've got to know what bias is in order to avoid it. Thus, we're talking about this today.
Yeah, so we talk about this, and you know, when it comes to state boards and lawsuits and various other things that might occur in an appraiser's life, it's one thing to be conscious of something and make a conscious and as you say, malevolent decision against something or someone. We would call that fraud, right? In this case, and a lot of times appraisers find themselves in trouble, I'm going to say innocently, because they don't know what they don't know, but not knowing isn't an excuse, is it, Tim?
No, not knowing is not an excuse, because the state gave us a credential, and that credential says, for example, if you're state certified residential, that you have the capacity, you have the training, you have the experience, etc., to appraise any 1 to 4 family house. And some states put a monetary limit on that, but you're qualified to appraise any such property in your state or the states in which you're certified. So as a result, no, you can't say, well, you know, appraisal board, yes, I'm certified, but I really didn't know what I was doing, and because I didn't know, you can't hold me responsible. Because they'll just chuckle and double the fine and triple the number of classes you're going to have to take. So no, innocence is not a defense. It may be an excuse, but it's not a defense.
Right. Now, I want to make it clear, Tim, that when we talk about bias, and the reason I want to make this clear is we right now as appraisers are dealing with this word bias. It's floated around in the national media. As you say, the political climate is trending toward this. A lot of times they're talking about racial bias, but you're not just talking about racial bias. You're talking about a human condition that pushes us one way or the other, even subconsciously, mostly subconsciously, where we don't even, again, as you said, we don't know what we don't know.
Right. If you look at USPAP's definition of bias, it basically says anything that inclines you away from being independent, impartial, and objective. So what inclines you away from that may be a conscious decision you make, or it may simply be that you don't know. And probably you don't know it, but yet you're still held responsible for it. And that's why you and I are talking about this today. And that's why in my mentoring and working with appraisers, we try to bring up that fact so that when a deficiency, a weakness does show up, that the appraiser understands that it's a weakness, why it's a weakness, and what the appraiser has to do to overcome that weakness, which is basically what you do. And when you say, well, appraisers, you don't know what the law of delegation is, you probably never heard of it, but now I'm going to explain it to you. So now you know.
Now you know. Okay, we're talking with Tim Andersen. He, of course, is the appraiser's advocate. Tim, when we get back, I want to talk maybe about a couple of course, anonymous. We wouldn't want you to share any confidential information, but you know, maybe examples of bias that you've seen on your advocacy side. Again, I want to dive a little bit more into how we as appraisers overcome this. You talked about education. Maybe we can get a little bit more specific. First, I want to get specific with you about your software. What are you using to do your appraisal reports, folks? I cannot underestimate the power of the tools that you are using, right? If you're a carpenter and you don't have a great hammer, you're going to be in trouble. If you're an appraiser and you don't have the best software out there for appraisal write-up, then you're going to be hamstrung. Again, you don't know what you don't know. And I'm telling you, folks, what you need to know is Alamode is the best. Check them out. Go to alamode.com or 800-ALAMODE. Speaking of the best, folks, how often do you think about your E&O insurance? And specifically, not just about insurance and about cost of insurance and about coverage. Those things are important. But what about the benefits, specifically benefits of free education and other things that you can find on the benefits tab of OREP insurance? OREP, of course, is my insurance of note and of choice. One of the reasons I do OREP is because they give me free continuing education. And one of those classes, at least one, maybe more, is taught by our good friend, Mr. Tim Andersen. Check him out. Go to orep.org for more information. It's orep.org. Welcome back to the program, everybody. We're talking with my good friend, the Appraiser's Advocate, Mr. Tim Andersen. Man, I can't believe I'm friends with the Appraiser's Advocate, Tim. How cool is that?
I'm blessed to be friends with the appraiser.
I appreciate you being on, my friend. I really do. The information that you bring to this program is so valuable. If appraisers will listen and really internalize what's going on, and this topic is so important because, again, I think we go by our day-to-day and we think we're doing what's right. We think we're doing things correctly, and then we learn something, right? I'll give you an example, Tim. Years ago, I found out about a service that you provide where you will take 2 to 3 appraisal reports, a typical appraisal reports, random appraisal reports, and you will review those from a state board perspective. In other words, utilizing your expertise, the things that you have seen over the years, being an advocate for appraisers before state boards, you'll look through those reports and you will find quote unquote deficiencies or things that could be better, things that could prevent possibly or at least allow us to be more secure in our appraisal reports. And you came back with so many great suggestions and things, honestly, Tim, I didn't know what I didn't know. One of them you've already brought up, highest and best use. I thought I understood highest and best use. And then you taught me some things about highest and best use, which were very, very, and have been very, very valuable. And so I encourage listeners to find out what they don't know and go to Tim because he has a wealth of knowledge. Speaking of that, I want to dive into that just a little bit. What are some things that you have seen, maybe some common things that you've seen with appraisers using this effect that you talked about, that you don't know what you don't know, the Dunning-Kruger effect, that appraisers need to be aware of?
The highest and best use has got to be that one use, that single use that brings the highest value to the property, typically the highest value to the land. So when an appraiser says the highest and best use is residential, that's probably true, but it's incomplete. What is the highest and best use of the land? Now, obviously, if the property is residential, it can't be an office building, okay? But is it a 3-2 house? Is it a 4-3.5 house? Is it a French Tudor architecture? Or, what is it? Because one of those will bring more money than another, all other things being equal. So highest and best use gives us the opportunity to say, well, I looked at all these uses and these won't work if the site were vacant. This is what you'd put up there. And appraisers constantly say there's no functional obsolescence in the subject property. Well, unless it's brand new, that's difficult to assume, simply because if the house is 50 years old, it was not built to current building codes. It was not built with current building materials. And it was built at a time when tastes were different. So yeah, it's going to have functional obsolescence, but chances are, so are your comps. Therefore, it doesn't really make all that much difference. But to say, nope, there's no functional obsolescence is just flat not true.
Right.
And let's face it, you can't build a 50-year-old house. You can only build a new house. So even if you leave the bone structure of the house standing, you go back in and significantly remodel it, you're lowering the effective age. So appraisers sometimes don't get the complete picture of functional obsolescence as part of highest and best use. And then another one is simply if it's going to cost $500,000 to repair the house, or excuse me, rather than repair, let's say remodel the house.
Right.
But the house is in its present state is worth only the entire property, the house and the site is worth $600,000. Then you're not going to spend $600,000 and put $500,000 into it to get $1.1 million for a house that's worth $600,000.
Right.
But that's not financially feasible. Therefore, it can't be the highest and best use. But yet, that is not an uncommon mistake. And state appraisal boards look at that and laugh and get all happy because they say, yep, we're going to get to nail another one. So if we can avoid that by understanding highest and best use, then we don't give the state reason to have fits of glee. And you say, well, the buyer can do what they want to with their house. It's their house, it's their money. Yeah, it is. That's not an issue. The issue is it the highest and best use of the site? And if it isn't, and if it's not financially feasible, it may be the buyer's dream home. Fine, they can build it and live in it. But as far as we're concerned, it's not the highest and best use because it's not financially feasible.
Tim, what would you say to a listener who is saying, well, Tim, I mean, I know about highest and best use. I took Appraising 101. I was trained by a mentor for 2 years before I started doing this on my own. I've been appraising for 12 plus years, and I do a highest and best use study on every single report.
I would say thank you. Then I would say, do you do it right?
Yeah. Well, they're going to say yes. I mean, because we don't know what we don't know.
Because we don't know what we don't know. That's why, Dustin, as you say, you've got to have somebody who is not emotionally involved. You've got to have somebody who can look at the entire forest, not merely the trees, to tell you if you understand what you're doing. And again, we get back to innocent mistakes, innocent errors. The chances are they are. Again, nobody wakes up and says, yep, going to screw 2 buyers over today. That doesn't happen with appraisers. Yeah. Yet what may happen is indeed they do, but it's inadvertent. It's innocent, as you said earlier. So as a result, every once in a while, it makes sense to send a report out or as in your case, talking about your business, you say, okay, Dustin, what can I do to make my business run more efficiently? What can I do to make my business generate more money without having to spend a lot more money to get it to the point where it generates more money? And in my case, somebody comes to me and says, maybe I really don't understand highest and best use. Will you go over that with me? And yeah, I'd be happy to. And that's what we do.
Education. That's the key, right?
Pretty much education and practice, but it's got to start with education. Yeah.
Tim, you are a great source for that education. Tell the listeners where they can reach you, how they can get a hold of you if they would like to learn what they don't know.
Dustin, thank you. Please contact me at tim@theappraisersadvocate.com.
Thank you, Tim.
My pleasure, Dustin. Thank you.
You've been listening to the Appraiser Coach podcast with Dustin Harris. If you like what you hear, please give us a 5-star rating and post a short review on iTunes. For more in-depth insider information on how you can make more money as a real estate appraiser, visit theappraisercoach.com and sign up for the All-Star team today. Thanks for joining us. And now, get out there and create some value.
Is it 2 stories? And editor, I'm sorry, there goes my telephone. I apologize for that. And you can put
dance time
Easter egg in this particular podcast.
This is why we don't do these things live.
Yeah, Dustin, I apologize to you. I thought I had muted it, but
it's all good, man. Happens to all of us.
I haven't muted it. Okay, editor, we're going to go back, and I'm going to attempt to overcome my stupidity. Okay. In 3, in 2, in 1.